My wife smiled and said, "You'll never be able to prove anything." I calmly asked, "Are you absolutely sure?" She nodded, so I picked up my phone. A few seconds later, someone else started talking, and her face lost all color. And if you're new here, subscribe to Vows Stories right now. I'm 36. I've spent the last 12 years working in telecommunications infrastructure, the kind of work that most people don't think about until their signal drops, which means I spend my professional life making sure the invisible systems that hold everything together are actually holding. I understand networks. I understand connections. I understand, more than most people, how much information exists in the gaps between what people say and what the actual record shows. That background is not incidental to this story. My wife and I had been married for 7 years. We lived in a mid-sized house in the suburbs of Atlanta. Good neighborhood, 2-car garage, the kind of life that looks exactly right from the outside and requires you to be paying attention from the inside to notice when something has started going wrong. We had been going wrong for about 14 months before the night with the phone. I want to be specific about what 14 months of going wrong looks like in a marriage because I think people assume these things announce themselves and they don't. They arrive in small adjustments. In a wife who used to leave her phone on the kitchen counter and now carries it everywhere. In the specific quality of her distraction on certain evenings. In the way conversations start to have a managed quality, not dishonest exactly, just curated. You notice the curation before you can name what's being curated. I noticed around month 4. I named it to myself around month 7. I started building the picture around month 9. Update 1. I want to tell you about the man first because understanding him is part of understanding the story. He was someone she worked with at her company, a mid-level manager in a different department, someone who had apparently been in her professional orbit for about 2 years before anything between them became what it became. She had mentioned him casually a few times in the early months, the way you mention a work colleague, a name in a story about a meeting or a project, nothing that registered as significant. Around month 4 of the 14, his name started appearing more frequently, still casually, still in work contexts, but with the increased frequency that is itself a signal if you're paying attention. I was paying attention. I did what I do professionally. I tracked patterns. Not aggressively, not invasively, just with the specific patience of someone who has spent 12 years watching systems and knows that patterns don't lie, even when people do. The pattern over months 4 through 8 was consistent. Late evenings at work that didn't correspond to visible deliverables, a phone behavior change that was subtle but clear to someone watching, and a quality of emotional distance from me that felt like bandwidth being spent somewhere else. Not rage, not coldness, just absence. The specific absence of someone whose attention is divided. By month 9, I had made a decision. Not about the marriage, about information. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I made any decision about anything else. And I wanted to build that understanding completely before I said a single word. I reached out to a friend of mine who does private investigative work. Someone I'd known for years through professional circles, someone I trusted completely. I told him what I suspected. I asked him to help me document it. He said he'd need a few weeks. He needed 6. What he brought me at the end of those 6 weeks was a documentation package that was thorough, time-stamped, and legally obtained. Photographs, records of locations, corroborating information from sources I won't detail here, a complete picture of what had been happening and for approximately how long. The how long was 9 months, not 4, not 7, 9. It had started 3 months before I'd noticed the first signal, which meant my instincts had been right and my timeline had been generous. I sat with that documentation for 3 weeks before I said anything. I needed to be certain about what I was going to do with it and how. This is the part that I think most people in my situation get wrong. They react before they're ready, and reacting before you're ready gives the other person time to adjust. I did not want to give her time to adjust. I wanted the truth to land the way truth lands when you can't prepare for it. Update 2. I chose a Sunday evening. Deliberately. Sunday evenings have a specific quality in our house. Slower. No work obligations pressing on either side. Dinner finished. The week not yet started. The kind of evening where a conversation can run as long as it needs to run without logistical interruption. I had the documentation on my phone, I had a separate folder on a cloud service. I had, through my friend's guidance, made sure everything was properly organized and accessible. I had also done something else that I'll describe in a moment. We were in the living room. She was on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading. I was in the chair across from her. I said, "I want to have a conversation." She said, "Okay." She put the book down. She gave me the specific attention of someone who has been waiting for a certain conversation and isn't sure if this is it. I said, "I know about him." She was still for a moment. Then, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean I know. I've known for a while. I've been very patient about saying anything because I wanted to make sure I understood the full picture before I brought it to this room." She looked at me and I watched her make a decision. The decision she made, in retrospect, tells me more about who she is than almost anything else in this story. She could have come clean. She could have taken the opening I was giving her. Instead, she settled back slightly, and her expression did something I hadn't expected. It became almost relaxed, calculating. She said, "You think you know something?" I said, "I don't think. I know." She said, "Then prove it." I said, "I'm sorry?" She smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, confident, slightly contemptuous, the smile of someone who believes they've covered their tracks and is about to watch you fail in front of them. She said, "You'll never be able to prove anything." The room went very quiet. I said, completely calmly, "Are you absolutely sure about that?" She nodded. Directly, deliberately. I picked up my phone. Update 3. I opened the app I'd set up 2 weeks earlier. It was a conference call setup. Professional grade. The kind I use for work when I need to pull multiple parties into a conversation without going through a standard phone service. I had 2 numbers already loaded. I pressed connect. There was a brief silence. Then a voice came through the speaker. My friend's voice. He identified himself by name and said, "I'm here and I have the documentation ready to reference if needed." Her smile was gone. Then a second voice. Her sister. Her sister lives in Charlotte, about 4 hours from us. I had called her 3 days before this conversation, not to be cruel and not to create a scene, but because I believe that when something of this magnitude is happening inside a family, the people in that family deserve to know. I had told her sister what I knew. I had shared enough of the documentation that she understood it was not speculation. I had asked her if she would be willing to be on a call, to simply confirm to her sister that she knew, and to say what she thought. Her sister said through the phone, "I've seen what he has, all of it. I've been sitting with this for 3 days, and I think you need to stop pretending. We all need to stop pretending." My wife's face had gone from the smile to something I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't guilt performing itself. It was the specific expression of someone who had been certain they were holding all the cards and had just watched every card lifted out of their hand simultaneously. She said, "You talked to her." I said, 3 days ago." She said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I've been preparing. There's a difference." Her sister said, through the phone, "I love you. You know that. That's why I'm on this call. Because someone in this family needed to be honest." I could see my wife processing, not what had been revealed, she already knew what had been revealed, but the scope of the preparation, that I had done this quietly, over months, that I had reached her sister, that I had organized the documentation through a professional, that the smile she'd given me, the absolute certainty she'd expressed, had been based on a version of me that hadn't been the version she was actually dealing with for the past several months. I said to the phone, "Thank you. I'll call you later." I ended the call. The room was just the 2 of us again. Update 4. She didn't deny anything after the call. I want to be precise about that because it's significant. The denial had been the strategy, and the strategy collapsed the moment she understood what I had. What replaced the denial was something quieter and, honestly, more difficult to sit across from. She looked like someone who had been running at full speed and had just stopped. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "What I suspected, about 5 months. What I could document, about 6 weeks." She said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I said, because I needed to be ready, and because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I decided what to do about it. She said, so what are you going to do? I said, that depends on this conversation. What followed was about 2 hours of talking, the kind of talking that only happens when there's nothing left to manage, when the version of events that was being maintained has been too completely disassembled to rebuild. She told me things I had suspected and things I hadn't. She told me how it had started, which was less dramatic than I'd imagined. She told me how long it had been, which was longer than I'd wanted to confirm. She told me what she had been telling herself about it, which was the most clarifying part of the conversation because the things we tell ourselves about the things we do reveal more about our character than the things we do. She had been telling herself that I was so focused on work that I wasn't present enough, that she had been lonely in a way she hadn't known how to name to me, that it had felt easier to find the attention elsewhere than to have the conversation that might have addressed the loneliness directly. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her she was wrong, because she wasn't entirely wrong about the loneliness, and I think part of fair accounting requires acknowledging that. I said, I want to say something clearly. I'm not going to pretend that our marriage was without problems. I've been absent in ways I know about and probably in ways I don't. That's real. But the response to feeling lonely in a marriage is a conversation, not 9 months of something else while you tell your husband everything is fine. She said, I know. I said, the smile. When I told you I knew and you told me to prove it, I need to understand where that came from. She looked at the table for a moment. She said, I thought if you couldn't prove it, I could keep it separate. Keep both things. I know how that sounds. I said, it sounds like you made a calculation about what I was capable of and got it wrong. She said, yes. Update 5. The week following that Sunday was one of the most logistically strange weeks of my adult life. We were in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, in the technical sense, but operating in completely separate emotional spaces. She was shaken in a way that I think was less about remorse and more about disorientation. She had built a version of the situation that required my ignorance, and the ignorance was gone, and she didn't know what shape anything was supposed to take anymore. I spent that week thinking clearly and without turbulence, which surprised me. I had expected anger to be louder than it was. What I felt was more like the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing in secret for a long time and has finally set it down. Not relief exactly, just the absence of the weight. I talked to an attorney on Thursday of that week. Not to make a decision, to understand my options, which is what I do in every situation that requires a decision. I understand the landscape before I move through it. I talked to my brother on Friday. He drove down from Tennessee and we sat on the back porch for 4 hours, and he said everything a brother says in this situation, some of it useful, some of it not, all of it genuinely well-intentioned. I appreciated the drive more than anything he said. Showing up is its own language. By the end of the week, I had made a decision. I told her on Sunday, 1 week after the conversation with the phone. I said, I've thought about this carefully. I'm filing for divorce. She said, is there anything? I said, I've thought about it carefully. I don't say things I haven't thought about carefully. She said, I know. I said, I'm going to handle the process as decently as I can. I don't want this to become something ugly. I want both of us to come out of it able to function. She said, okay. I said, the smile. I just want you to know, that smile is the specific thing I keep coming back to. Not what you did. How certain you were that I didn't know. That's what tells me everything I need to know about where we actually were. She didn't say anything to that. I didn't need her to. Final update. It has been 5 months. The divorce was finalized 8 weeks ago. We were, as I had hoped, decent about the process. Our attorneys managed the practical elements without the proceedings becoming a theater of grievances, which I credit to both of us for managing something inherently painful without weaponizing it. The house sold quickly, Atlanta market. It was under contract in 11 days. I'm in an apartment in Midtown now, which is an adjustment after 7 years in the suburbs. but an adjustment I find I don't mind. The city has a rhythm that the suburbs don't have, and I'd forgotten how much I respond to that rhythm. Work is good. My team is strong. The invisible systems are holding. Her sister and I are still in occasional contact. She reached out about a month after everything concluded, not to discuss her sister, just to say she hoped I was doing well. I told her I was. I meant it. What I think about now, 5 months out, is the preparation. Those 6 weeks of documentation, the 3 days before the call when I sat with the knowledge that I'd contacted her sister and had to wait for Sunday to arrive. The patience of it. I've spent my career making sure invisible systems hold under pressure, and I applied that same discipline to the hardest situation I've been in, and it held. She told me I'd never be able to prove anything. She was wrong about the proof. But more than that, she was wrong about me, about what I pay attention to, about what I'm willing to build quietly while nobody's watching. The phone call lasted about 45 seconds before she understood. 5 months later, I'm fine. The smile cost her more than the secret did. That's how it usually goes. I want to stop right here and get your honest take on this, because this story has a moment that I keep thinking about. When she smiled and said, "You'll never be able to prove anything," what would you have done in that exact moment? Would you have handled it the same way, or would you have moved differently? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This community is real and every response gets read. And before you go, you decide what comes next on Vows Stories. Leave a comment below and tell me the story you need to hear. A betrayal that unraveled because of one small detail someone forgot to hide? A person who was underestimated by everyone and then showed up in a way nobody predicted? A moment where the quietest move turned out to be the most powerful one? Tell me what you want, and the most requested idea becomes the next upload. Drop it right now.